Welcome and thank you everybody for joining us for today's C2 Smart webinar. I am Lizzie, the Research Project Manager at C2 Smart, which is a US DOT Tier 1 University Transportation Research Center. And today we are joined by Chetan Sharma, who will present on reducing US transit costs, an empirical review and comparative case study of Portland-Manchester rail systems. Chetan is a civil engineer and licensed PE who has worked on the design of multiple rail, BRT, and municipal roadway projects in New York City and the Pacific Northwest. And he's currently a graduate student in NYU's Transportation Management Program and an FHWA Eisenhower Fellow. And this research project was the product of his Eisenhower Fellowship. And we're also joined by Professor Joseph Chow, Associate Professor in the Department of Civil and Urban Engineering at NYU and the Deputy Director of C2 Smart. And as always, we'll be recording this webinar and then uploading it to our YouTube channel. And we encourage everybody to ask questions today. You can do so by pressing the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. You can do it throughout the presentation, and then we'll read out your questions at the end. And with that, I'll hand things over to our presenter to get us started.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will share my screen. 1 second.
Perfect.
And just wanted to confirm that you can see my screen.
Yep, looks great.
Let me actually check something. Okay, I can change slides as well. Okay. Yeah, so thanks for calling in, joining the webinar. My name is Chetan Sharma, as Lizzie had mentioned, and I'm presenting on this project that I worked on along with my advisor, Joseph Chow, I'll just read the title again. So, Reducing US Transit Costs, an Empirical Review and Comparative Case Study of Portland and Manchester Rail Systems. Sorry, 1 sec, let me get my note set up. Cool, there we go. Okay. So a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to start just kind of explaining why we should care about this issue, why we should care about transit costs in particular. Then I'm going to talk about why we focused on Portland and Manchester's light rail systems in particular and why there's value in doing that. Then I'm going to give you a kind of quick outline of our research methodology, which is also essentially the report outline that will be published afterwards. And then I'm going to focus on kind of two parts of that report in our work. One is the data review that we did, looking at cost data from multiple sources. And then I'm going to spend hopefully the bulk of this presentation just going into our findings and recommendations and going through our findings, talking more about the case studies themselves through the findings. Okay, so why should we care about transit costs? I'm sure many of the people who called in already know this, but the cost to build, to operate, to maintain all transportation, including transit, but all transportation infrastructure in the United States is consistently higher than it is pretty much anywhere else in the world. And this cost discrepancy, we're focusing on transit, this cost discrepancy exists even when you compare the United States to places like, let's say, France or Sweden or the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, countries that have expensive land, that have labor shortages and high labor costs, that have unions, that have environmental regulations. So a lot of the usual things that people point to justify this cost discrepancy, they may still be true, but there are lots of countries around the world that have found ways to transcend these issues and still build, operate, and maintain transit for lower cost than we have. The other thing to note here is it's not that we're spending more money because we're building better facilities or we have higher quality facilities. There's a lot of different ways that you can measure the success of a transportation system. Safety is one of them. And you can see on the bottom right here a couple statistics, both for road safety and rail safety, that it's not the case that we're spending more money to get better outcomes. We're spending more money to get essentially worse outcomes. And this issue is going to become, this is a problem. We need to find a way to solve this problem. And this issue is going to become increasingly important, partly because we passed the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which had the nation's largest ever investment in transit and in rail. And partly because there have been a lot of local ballot measures where voters have voted to spend money on transit expansion. I listed a number of cities here: Phoenix, Seattle, Los Angeles, Austin, Miami, and Atlanta. In each of these locations, there have been ballot measures supporting transit expansion. And in each of these cases, those transit expansions have subsequently been rolled back or delayed due to escalating cost. So it's important that we find a way to address this issue and to solve this issue. Okay, so why compare Portland and Manchester specifically? There's a lot going on this slide, but the bottom line that I'm trying to convey here is that these two cities are very similar, and these two systems, light rail systems, are also very similar in a lot of ways. So you can see that just through the pictures and the maps on the right of the slide. But on the left of the slide, and there's a more detailed table like this in our report, but we're comparing the cities. The size of the cities are similar. The median incomes are similar. I didn't put it into this table, but the climates are quite similar. And then when you go into the systems themselves, look at the annual ridership and the weekday ridership. They're very similar to each other. They both open during similar time periods, so the infrastructure is at a similar age. Their rolling stock, their vehicles are very similar. The platform lengths are the same. The means by which they propel themselves, their propulsion systems are the same. Their track length is, within 5 miles of each other. The stations are within 2 stations of each other. Track gauge, one would expect to be the same. That's fairly standardized. And then the kind of general configuration of these systems as well, where you have a more street running, kind of streetcar-esque system in downtown and a more grade separated system outside downtown. Those are also attributes that these systems share. So there's a lot of similarities between these systems. But then when you get to the operating cost, the picture looks fairly different. So while Portland has about a 30% fare box recovery rate, fare box recovery is a metric of how much of the overall operations and maintenance spend is being gathered through fares as opposed to other revenue, or being recovered through fares, I should say. You can see that Manchester effectively pays for itself through fares. Portland requires a significant subsidy. And that's not just due to higher fares, because if you look at the cost per passenger mile, again, you see quite a discrepancy. I will note here, this is not about picking on Portland. And the main reason it's not about picking on Portland is, as I'll show later, Portland's max light rail system performs above the US average across all 4 operating cost metrics that we looked at for urban rail systems. So that, in my mind, is another reason why this is a useful case study, is the similarity in specifications, the divergence in cost, and despite the divergence in cost, the more expensive system here is still cheaper than the average US system to operate. Similarly, now we're looking at on the capital side, and just like on the operation side, there are some similarities. On the capital side, once again, there are 2 recent capital projects. So the furthest right map here is the Orange Line in Portland, and then the middle map here is the airport line in Manchester. Again, these are pretty similar projects, similar specifications, completed during similar timeframes. Portland has a little bit more elevated guideway, which is more expensive. Manchester has more stations and more length to it. But again, we've got a relative similarity in these projects. And again, you go to the bottom of that table there and you look at the capital costs. And again, you see a fairly significant divergence. And so once again, it's an opportunity to say, given the similarities, what's still being done differently? And based on what's still being done differently, what can we learn from that? Okay, so the overall kind of methodology that went into our report. So the first thing that we did is we just tried to look at what kind of information is out there that covers transit costs. And that's literature, previous reports that have been published by other people, research papers that have been published by others, statements that have been made by others, as well as a data review looking at what kind of data is publicly available, what kind of number crunching can we do from that data that also may teach us something. Then we also did a case study review, and that's just comparing Portland and Manchester specifically, and that was based on field visits. It was based on interviews with staff, document provision through FOIA requests and through other requests as well. Putting all of that together, we developed a hypothesis list. So there were 74 hypotheses in this hypothesis list that we developed, and these are hypotheses for potential factors that can contribute to higher or lower transit operating cost, capital cost, whatever. And we started to evaluate these hypotheses. So we first evaluated these hypotheses against the case studies. recognizing that these two systems are so similar. And then for the hypotheses that seemed promising when we looked at the case studies, we then tried to find corroborating information. So corroborating information either through data, other studies that have been done, other examples that can either confirm or contradict our evaluation based on the case study. And then based on all of this, we then developed a list of findings and recommendations, 14 policy recommendations in our report. So that's kind of the high level overview. As I mentioned, this presentation will predominantly focus on that data review and then the findings and recommendations, and then we'll kind of circle back from there. And then the last thing I wanted to do here is just acknowledge a number of people and organizations that helped with this. So there's 2 research groups here in New York City, the Transit Cost Project that's part of the NYU Planning School, as well as the Eno Center, which is a think tank here in New York City that have done a lot of research of their own on capital cost that we cite quite a bit. And then a whole series of expert sources. And that's what these 2 tables are here. Some of these expert sources just responded to emails and provided information. Some of them participated in interviews. Some of them, in the case of Manchester, also provided facility tours. So just want to appreciate their contributions as well. The table on the top are expert sources pertaining to the case studies themselves. Table on the bottom are expert sources pertaining to other kinds of information. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into some of these numbers here. So this is the data review. These are 4 graphs. There's a lot in these graphs. These are graphs that show urban US rail systems evaluated across 4 operating cost metrics. So the metric on the farthest right, fare box recovery, so that's a measure of the total operations and maintenance expenditure for each of these transit systems. How much of that cost are they recovering through fares? So how much are they getting back through fares? Then you go to the second to the right, that's the cost per passenger mile. So now we've taken out fares. Some transit agencies may make a policy decision to have lower fares and get revenue from elsewhere. So this is looking at purely the cost per passenger mile. And then you go further to the left, the 2 graphs on the left. Now we've taken out both ridership and fare, and we're just looking at the cost per service hour. So one of them, the further in one, is the cost per car service hour, and then the one that's furthest to the left is the cost per train service hour. And so this is ignoring ridership and fare entirely and just looking at how much does it cost per hour of service to run these systems. It's important to look at all of these metrics because, for example, we're here in New York City. New York does pretty well on the two metrics on the right-hand side because we have a lot of ridership, dense population. But if you look at the 2 metrics on the left-hand side, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. Some New York systems actually struggle quite a bit when you purely look at them on the cost per hour metric. So it's important to evaluate kind of all of these metrics. And then the other thing I'll note is MAX, which is Portland's light rail system. I'm not going to hunt for it in every single one of these, but essentially MAX is performs better than average across all 4 of these metrics. Okay, so a couple more sort of metrics that we looked at, data number crunching going on here. On the bottom left is a comparison of costs by mode. So that includes sort of FTA's modal classifications, our own classifications that are based more on the market, sort of urban regional systems, and then other modes. There's a lot of numbers in here, but essentially the bottom line that I think is important to glean from the table that's on the bottom left here is there's no modal silver bullet. So it's not like we can magically, if we just did light rail, moving forward, we just use light rail, or we just use BRT, that would fix our problem. Each of these modes has a strength and a weakness. And so each of these modes, you can see that the costs are somewhat comparable to each other. The table on the right here looks at wherever we could obtain data. I'll back up for a second. One of the things the US does really well is gather this kind of operating cost data. The FTA has very comprehensive data. And at least, from my perspective, I was not able to find as much comprehensive data elsewhere in the world. But where we could, it's in this table on the right here. And it shows corresponding metrics for fare box recovery as well as cost per passenger mile for transit systems around the world. And again, the bottom line to glean from here is, contrary to popular belief, a lot of transit systems around the world actually lean pretty heavily on their fare revenue to run their systems. Most of these systems still need subsidy, but they don't need as much subsidy as the average US rail system. Okay, moving on, some more number crunching that we did. So this, we looked at the Pearson's correlation coefficient. So this is a measure of statistical correlation. For those of you who have more of a mathematical background, if you were to draw a line of best fit, how strongly does that line of best fit actually work between two data sets? That's essentially what this is measuring. So the closer we are to 1 or -1, the stronger the statistical correlation. The closer we are to 0, the weaker the statistical correlation. So in this table, on the left-hand side are a whole series of operations metrics, either provided by the FTA or calculated based on FTA data. And on the top are those same four efficiency metrics that we looked at earlier. Again, a couple things that can be gleaned from here. One is wage, definitely average wage definitely has an impact on operating cost, but it's not necessarily as strong as one might assume. In fact, the metric below wage often, not always, but often performs stronger than wage. That metric is what we call staff hours per car service hour. And so that's essentially saying for every car service hour that a transit agency is able to provide, how many staff hours are being logged, all kinds of staff hours. It's everything from, the driver to cleaning staff, mechanics, management, admin, how many hours are being logged on the back end to make that work. And in many cases, that metric has a stronger correlation to operating cost than wage itself. Couple of the things to glean here that I'll kind of circle back on in the findings section. Average speed shows a relatively strong correlation here, and energy efficiency as well shows a relatively strong correlation when we look at this kind of statistical analysis as well. Okay, so looking at capital costs, the situation is a bit different. There's not as much comprehensive data that's created by any kind of federal agency, but there is a lot of data that's been produced by the Transit Cost Project and by the ENO Center, those other two organizations that I'd mentioned. And so what we did here is we essentially pulled in their data. So what they have is they have a whole series of capital projects, rail projects, and they look at everything from, what kind of grade is it at, percent below grade, percent elevated, percent at grade. ENO Center also looked at mode, where was it built, when was it built. And so we took their data, we merged it. The ENO Center has more US projects, the Transit Cost Project has more international projects. So we merged their data together. And then we decided to try and filter this data to get as close to an apples to apples comparison as possible, just as we've attempted to do with the case study, to get as close to an apples to apples comparison as possible. So we filter by a couple of things. So one argument that's made for why US capital costs are so high is that it's a developed country, right? In a developing country, labor is cheaper, materials are cheaper, lots of things are cheaper. So we used HDI. This is the Human Development Index. This is a metric that's released by the UN that measures how developed is a society. And we said we're only going to look at transit capital projects that were delivered in countries that have an HDI that is comparable to US states and US territories. So that's one way of trying to filter. Then we said, another common argument that's made is countries that are not democracies can build projects much more quickly than countries that are democracies because they don't have to compensate people for land. They don't have to deal with public outreach process or political processes. So there's a nonprofit called Freedom House that produces what's called a freedom index. So we used that and we said, okay, we're only going to look at countries that have a freedom index that is comparable to US states and territories as well. And then lastly, another argument that's made is, it's more expensive to build things in expensive cities. So there's an index called the Mercer's Cost of Living Index that looks at I think it's about the 300 most expensive cities around the world. And so we said, okay, we'll only look at projects that are in cities that are ranked in the Mercer's Cost of Living Index. And then that index is also noted in these tables here. So we're only going to look at expensive cities. The resulting tables that you see are tables that say, okay, once we control for all of this, what are some of the most expensive or cheapest projects around the world in the last 30 years or so? Looking at, predominantly underground projects on the left, predominantly at-grade projects on the top right, and mostly elevator projects on the bottom right. There's not as many elevator projects in these data sets. And then again, what you see here is the US, our projects have a tendency to cluster around the most expensive. In the cheapest end, countries that seem to show up quite a bit, South Korea shows up quite a bit. Italy shows up a fair bit. You also see Germany and France quite a bit, although the caveat I'd put out there is that if you look at the full data set, German and French costs there's a much bigger range there. Whereas, Italy, South Korea, you seem to see on the kind of low end. And again, that corroborates findings from both the ENO Center and the Transit Cost Project. Okay, so that was kind of a quick overview of some of our data. All those tables will be in the report. This is our hypothesis table. Obviously, there's a lot of text here through all of our hypotheses, but just to kind of illustrate our methodology a little bit more here, based on some of that, as well as a literature review, we developed this list of hypotheses along with a source. And then we started to evaluate these 74 hypotheses against the two transit systems. And then for the ones that were promising, we then went one step further and said, is there corroborating information elsewhere? And there is narrative in the report for most of these hypotheses explaining how we came to the conclusions that we came to. Yeah, so all of that information is there. I'm going to go sort of after this directly into our findings, and in the process, we'll discuss some of these hypotheses a little bit more. Okay, so this is the first sort of finding that we put, and I know that this is an issue that's been discussed quite a bit. So the finding here that we recommended was to address abuse in the NEPA environmental review process. So what do I mean by that? So for people to understand, in most developed democracies, when you build a new capital project of any kind, you have to go through an environmental disclosure process. Here in the US, it's called a NEPA process. The document that's produced is usually called an EIS, Environmental Impact Statement. The fact that we have that process, which is a disclosure process, is not unique to the US at all. But what we did find is that our process in the US is far more vague than comparable processes elsewhere in the world. And therefore, it's far more prone to legal action that is often in bad faith, which in turn means that this process becomes just a lot more cumbersome. So how did we come to that conclusion? Neither Portland nor Manchester explicitly noted the costs associated with the development of environmental documentation. However, we can essentially quantify the level of effort involved in this project. And the way we can do that, I'm an engineer, this is what we would do when we scope a project, is we just look at how big are the end deliverables, right? How big are the documents? And in turn, you can kind of assume based on how big the documents are, how much time was spent and effort and money was spent in determining all of this work. The EIS for the Portland Max Orange line, when you compare it to the EIA, the corresponding document in Manchester, you're looking at a length difference that is somewhere between 15 times as long and 30 times as long, which is pretty significant. We then spoke to some staff in Manchester, and they noted that some of the things that we cover in our environmental review process are covered through other documents in Manchester. So we sort of combined all of that together. So in the US, our EIS and our record of decision, ROD, on our side. And then in the UK, their EIA, which is their environmental impact assessment, and their TWAO, which is the Transportation Works Act order, which is a corresponding document. Again, you just compare the lengths and the size of these documents. And in that case, you're looking at a difference that is between 3 times as long for Portland and 9 times as long for Portland, depending on whether you measure it by word or by page. So the bottom line here is we put a lot more effort into our environmental documentation. You start to look at some corroborating sort of examples. Both New York and London has implemented a congestion pricing system. New York is in the process of implementing a congestion pricing system. London did not have to go through any environmental review for their congestion pricing. New York, I believe the legislature authorized congestion pricing either in 2018 or 2019. That process is still being delayed due to environmental review and due to legal action associated with environmental review. So that corroborates our findings. And then a couple other notes I'd note here. So one of the things that the UK does is that the UK government publishes a very clear list of projects which trigger environmental review. So for example, on roadway projects, they explicitly say that you will only have to go through the environmental review process if your project ends up creating a road that is 4 or more lanes wide for 10 or more kilometers. And so that kind of clear guidance can allow this process to be less vague, allow for less bad faith legal action, but still allow for an environmental review process that makes sure that we're making sure that we're not harming the environment in the process of this project. And the last thing I'd note here is the kind of ironic aspect of this is that transit is an environmental benefit, but oftentimes transit projects in the US are slowed down or stopped due to environmental review. So a lot of jurisdictions around the world, again, looking at corroborating information here, including Ontario, including Australia, including Turkey, in recognition of this fact, have explicitly said that transit projects will go through a more abridged environmental permitting process than other projects. Okay, so our second sort of capital cost recommendation, ensuring consistency between authority and responsibility in project governance, meaning that the agency that's tasked with building a project should also have the authority to do so. Why do we say this? As an engineer, I'm sure anyone who's worked on capital projects has come across this. The moment one agency begins to try and build a capital project, every other agency or many other agencies in the region will look at them and see dollar signs and essentially say, all right, how do we get you to pay for some of our stuff? So looking at this when looking at TriMet and Transport for Greater Manchester, TriMet's the agency in Portland, Transport for Greater Manchester in Manchester. TriMet owns the transit network in Portland. TriMet does not own the road network. TriMet does not own traffic signals. TriMet does not own railroads, mainline railroads. By contrast, in Manchester, the mayor of Greater Manchester, who is a metropolitan area mayor, is not only in charge of the transit system in Manchester, the Greater Manchester mayor is in charge of the signals, is in charge of the major roads network, is in charge of the motorways, which are their freeways. All of that is under one roof. So what kind of impact did that have on the project? TriMet spent over $200 million on right-of-way acquisition. Transport for Greater Manchester essentially spent nothing on right-of-way acquisition. There were 2 minor fee takes that were done before the project began. Beyond that, they spent nothing. So that's a huge difference. And TriMet had to deal with a series of design requirements that were imposed on it by other jurisdictions, which Transport for Greater Manchester did not have to deal with. So these include a 25-foot track clearance requirement that the Union Pacific Railroad imposed on TriMet, which is not a clearance requirement that's followed elsewhere in the country or in many other places in the country, particularly here on the East Coast. And local jurisdictions imposed quiet zone requirements on TriMet. These are requirements that made TriMet essentially upgrade all of the the level crossings, not only for itself, for its own light rail tracks, but also for other mainline railroad tracks and mainline railroad crossings in the region. Some corroboration to this, prior study from the Transit Cost Project has found that on the Second Avenue Subway project, New York City, the MTA spent between $250 million and $300 million, essentially satisfying permit requirements from other agencies. A couple images here on the bottom is a little snippet from some of TriMet's design roll plot. Everything, all the black lines are things TriMet built. And so you'll see the yellow there is what is TriMet's own tracks, Portland's own tracks. You see that Portland was on the hook for building a lot more than their own tracks. By contrast, the picture on the top here is a picture from Manchester, and you'll see that Manchester has light rail track that run immediately adjacent to freight railroads without issue, without the 25-foot clearance requirement. Okay, third capital cost recommendation here. Developing comprehensive design standards. So as engineers, when we design any kind of new facility, we're not designing everything, right? We're referencing preset standardized designs to the extent that we can. On roadway projects in the United States, there's a lot of national guidance that we can fall back on. So national guidance from AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, the MUTCD. There's a lot of this national guidance. In the UK, this national guidance also exists for transit. So this little booklet that I showed on the far right, essentially the cover of the booklet, this is a national design guidance manual that is developed by the UK government for all light rail systems across the United Kingdom, which means that there's greater levels of standardization in design, less confusion. By contrast, TriMet, like virtually every transit agency in the United States, has to develop its own design criteria that are unique and somewhat different from the design criteria that are used by other transit agencies or other railroads or other facilities. To some degree, TriMet will fall back on an organization called ARIMA, but ARIMA focuses on freight rail not on transit. Those two things are a little bit different, and I'll circle back on that a little bit. But greater levels of standardization can also help reduce cost. Okay, switching over to operations costs here for a second. So our first recommendation here is to embrace modern rolling stock design. And what I mean by that rolling stock essentially are vehicles, trains in this case. There's two major design elements that have been incorporated in places like Manchester that it would be useful for us to incorporate to a greater degree in Portland and here in the US generally. So one has to do with the material that car shells are made out of and the resulting weight that car shells have. And the other is passenger door control. So looking at rolling stock weight, Manchester and Portland have light rail vehicles that are quite similar. You see a kind of schematic of these vehicles. The schematic is on the bottom right here. The top is Manchester and the bottom is Portland. Portland's rail cars are 7 US tons heavier per rail car than Manchester's. And this has to do with the materials used. For context, a school bus is about 5 tons. So essentially, you're adding a school bus and some change in weight when you're comparing these two vehicles. Now, some justifications or rationales that were used by TriMet for this, and TriMet is not alone in this, are noted below. And as part of our research project, we essentially found that these rationales alone, there's precedent to show that they're not actually, I don't want to sound harsh, they're not valid. There may be other rationales, but these are the rationales we could obtain. So the first one is that TriMet cited FRA regulations. In the United States, we have unique regulations regarding buff strength requirements for rail cars that essentially make it difficult to use materials other than steel. The issue with that is these regulations never were designed for transit vehicles. They were designed for mainline railroads, right? I mentioned falling back on ARIMA because we don't have national design guidance in this country, national transit design guidance. So these were never intended for transit. And on top of that, the FRA actually changed these regulations in 2018, but many transit agencies have not necessarily realized that. On top of that, two additional arguments that were made. One was the issue of corrosion in coastal environments, and the other was manufacturer preference. And there's some interviews that we did with rolling stock, experts and others. Manufacturers for rolling stock prefer using a combination of steel and aluminum. And corrosion, I'm a civil, I'm not a mechanical, but there is plenty of precedent for running rail cars that are both a combination of steel and aluminum in coastal environments, without corrosion, or while dealing with corrosion concerns, I should say. Here in the US, BART and MARTA have both been using a combination of aluminum and steel since their founding in their rail cars. And these are the two most energy efficient rail systems in the country. I'd mentioned the correlation between energy efficiency and operating cost earlier. Along with Manchester, they've been using aluminum and steel together in their rolling stock. The new Acela rail cars in Amtrak, the new Caltrain rail cars, the new WMATA rail cars in DC are all going to be using aluminum in their car shell construction to lighten their weight, but many transit agencies have still not made this shift. And then the other issue, passenger door control, this is much simpler. A lot of light rail trains that transit agencies procure, they require you to press a button to open the door. You press a button to open the door. What that means is the transit agencies are spending less money on HVAC, less on ventilation, air conditioning, heating. The door's only opening when it actually needs to let someone in and out. And yeah, I'd mentioned many rolling stock, or much rolling stock, a lot of rolling stock, I should say, in the United States already has this functionality. It's just not used in many cases. Another recommendation here is to embrace operations franchising. So like most US transit agencies, the Max Light Rail system in Portland, the TriMet system, everyone who works on that system is a direct employee of TriMet. This is fairly unique to the United States. Metrolink in Manchester, like a lot of Europe and some parts of Asia, uses a franchising system. So how does the franchising system work? It's not privatization. So the physical assets are all still owned by Transport for Greater Manchester, and it is Transport for Greater Manchester that sets the route, sets the fares, collects the fares, that handles the planning efforts. All of that is still handled by the public sector. but the actual day-to-day operations are handled by a private company through a competitive bidding process. So right now, the company that runs Metrolink is called Keolis AMI Metrolink. It's a private company, private consortium that won that contract in 2017. They have it till 2027. And in 2027, Manchester can decide whether they were happy with their operations or not, and then potentially pick another operator or not pick another operator. This system is used in a lot of different places. It's used in Phoenix in the United States, in the Phoenix Valley Metro, which does really well across 3 of the 4 operating cost metrics here in the US. It's also done in the London bus network, in the Elizabeth line, the new line that opened in London, in the Copenhagen Metro, in the Singapore bus network, in Melbourne's train network, and in Dutch buses, German buses. This is quite common. The European Union is working to essentially try and get a lot more of its member states to use this business model. And prior study has shown that this business model can lead to an approximate 20% operating cost reduction, as well as a customer satisfaction improvement associated with that. Okay, our third operating cost recommendation here is to prioritize speed, obviously in a safe way, but to prioritize transit speed. Why do we say that? So between 60 and 70% of operations and maintenance costs for developed nation transit systems are labor. This is true using the FTA data. It's true of Portland. It's also true of Manchester. This is not just driver labor. This is all labor. Because labor is paid by the hour, essentially what that means is the faster your system, the more efficient your system. Why does this matter? The MTA, when it was briefly run by Andy Byford, began something that was called a safety and speed task force. And what they had found was that there were a lot of temporary speed restrictions in the New York subway that were done through an abundance of caution, which is obviously a good thing, but there had not been a genuine engineering analysis that had been done afterwards to say, is this genuinely a safety concern? Do we really need this speed restriction? Is there something minor that we can do to change the design or the signaling or something else of this trackway to increase the speed? They identified about 600 potential locations, and so far speeds have been increased in about 200 locations in the New York City subway. Looking at Max and Metrolink, these two systems operate with similar speeds. Max in Portland is about 2.5 miles an hour, a little under 3 miles an hour faster on average than Metrolink. However, if you look at the design of Max in Portland, it should be operating much faster, theoretically at least, or at the looks of it from the outside, it should be operating much faster relative to Portland. And this is because Max uses a lot more active warning, meaning gates and flashers, which Metrolink often does not. Max has double wire catenary rather than single wire catenary. Max has a higher top speed, 55 miles an hour versus 50. Max has more grade separation, and Max uses a more advanced signaling system. Metrolink uses what's called a line of sight signaling system. Essentially, Metrolink trains operate like a bus or a car would operate. You need to pay attention to what's in front of you and be slow enough to be safe. Whereas Max uses a more traditional railroad signaling system outside of downtown with block signaling. So what this suggests is that there are opportunities for higher speed while protecting safety. And these pictures are some examples of that. So these show active warning design in these two locations. I'm just going to check time. Active warning design in these two locations. Active warning meaning gates and flashers. The bottom is in Portland, the top is in Manchester. And you can see in the bottom, there are quad gates, but the sidewalk is actually not blocked off at all. And this is following a REMA standard. The sidewalk is not blocked off at all, which means there's no means of protecting pedestrians from trains in this location. The quad gates only protect vehicular traffic. In Manchester, you can see that the quad gates, the railroad gates, are integrated into adjacent fence, and they run across the sidewalk. So they've completely cordoned off this level crossing. In Manchester, trains run at 50 miles an hour through this crossing. In Portland, they run at 30. So there's an opportunity. Obviously, it requires more analysis, but there's an opportunity here. Another one, I know I'm a little short on time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly through here, but a lot of transit agencies have this issue of maintenance, that there are maintenance backlogs. They don't know how to fund them. It's tougher to get political support for funding for maintenance. The way the folks in Manchester talked about this is they essentially said because they rely so heavily on fares, they don't have to wait for political support for maintenance funding. They can use their own fare revenue. How do they rely so heavily, or how do they get more fare revenue? Part of that is that they have a much more complicated fare structure. They have much higher base fares, but they have a lot more discounts for people who need it. So people who travel during the off-peak, people who travel shorter distances, people who are on job training programs in college, seniors, younger people. There are a lot more discounts for people who need it, coupled with a higher base fare, and this allows them to get some of that money up front to spend on maintenance up front. And not allow some of their maintenance expenditure to allow their maintenance obligations to fester over a longer period of time. Related to that, Manchester also has a much lower rate of fare evasion. Part of that is related to enforcement, but part of that is also related to the fact that they have a more essentially progressive or graduated fare structure. Okay, this is the last major operating cost recommendation that I was going to focus on, and this has to do with procurement reform. I focused here on rolling stock, but these regulations apply to a lot of other forms of procurement. So when Max in Portland, the last time they ordered rail cars, their rail cars were $1.2 million more expensive per car than comparable rail cars in Manchester. Two major procurement issues that we were able to find that are related to this. So one are Buy America requirements. So the UK has no make in Britain or buy Britain requirements. British transit agencies can buy rolling stock from wherever they want to. Because rolling stock, the market for rail cars is so cyclical, it's difficult for a lot of vendors to meet Buy America requirements. And so the last time Portland was looking for rail cars, they essentially got proposals from 2 vendors. By contrast, Manchester got proposals from 4, which was viewed as unusually low. Usually in the UK, they're used to getting proposals from 6 to 7. Part of that had to do with the fact that Manchester uses high floor light rail vehicles. Obviously, this is a politically charged issue. I'm just raising that this is an issue. I'll leave it there. The second one is limitations on scalable orders. Transit agencies often don't know when they want to order new rail cars because they don't know when their equipment's going to break down. Manchester has a deal with Bombardier, preset prices where they can essentially call up Bombardier and say, hey, we need 2 new rail cars, and they'll get their 2 new rail cars. In the US, that kind of procurement agreement is illegal. So transit agencies have to essentially go through a competitive bidding process every time, and that means ordering rail cars in bulk. That also means you have to order extra rail cars because you don't really know what's going to happen in the future. And you see that in this picture. The rail car that's closest to us in this picture is Manchester's original rail cars. These are no longer in operation. By contrast, Portland's original rail cars are still in operation. So because of these restrictions, US transit agencies have a tendency to be forced to use older equipment for much longer, which can exacerbate maintenance costs as well. And there's a report from the Government Accountability Office that corroborates some of our findings here. Okay, as I mentioned, there's 14 recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them. So these are some of our other recommendations. I'm just going to kind of touch on briefly before closing here. So on the capital cost, avoidance of over design or over customization, this corroborates findings from the Transit Cost Project and the Eno Center. Looking at some of the Metrolink facilities, Metrolink gets much tighter frequencies out of smaller facilities. So, higher frequencies with fewer platforms and fewer tracks than Portland does. Portland, in many cases, ends up using more track to get lower frequency. So this corroborates some of the findings from others. On the operations side, adjusting car lengths based on demand. A lot of US transit agencies like Portland always use 2-car trains. By contrast, Manchester switches it up depending on their expected demand. And there's prior study from other academic organizations that have found that you do save money by adjusting train lengths, even though it means you have more labor costs and kind of changing the lengths of your trains, you do save money. Also cleaning trains during the day. Manchester does both daytime cleaning and nighttime cleaning. Portland does almost exclusively nighttime cleaning. Heating costs, particularly in certain seasons, overnight can be quite high. You also, oftentimes when people work overnight, they need double time. They deserve it. It's an inconvenience, but both because of heating costs and because of some overtime requirements, to the extent possible, if trains are cleaned during the daytime, if trains are cleaned during layover periods at the end of the line, that can also help control costs. Avoidance of mixing operations and capital costs. I have more detail about this in the report. Some of the most expensive, well, actually, let me back up. Manchester used to use a design, build, operate business model, and they moved away from it because they were running into some problems with it. And some of the most expensive lines to operate per car hour or per train hour in the United States are lines that were delivered using a design, build, operate business model. So that oftentimes the consortium that built the system, if they're also the consortium that operates them, they have a tendency to inflate their operating costs to recover some profits through that. So that needs to be something that we're aware of as well. And then lastly, there's two items that we noted for future consideration. These are two items that didn't pass the case study evaluation, but there's quite a bit of evidence that is compelling. So one is making unit costs public. So highway agencies in the United States, when they build new roads, after they build new roads, they make their unit costs publicly available. So they say this is how much it costs per cubic yard of concrete. This is how much it costs, per street light or whatever. Transit agencies do not generally make that information public. That makes it tougher to control costs. So making that information public would also be helpful. And then considering automation, there's some data in our data review, we found essentially automating a transit system will save you about 40% on your operations and maintenance cost. And it'll also allow for better frequencies, better reliability, therefore hopefully higher ridership and so on. Anyway, these are more minor recommendations. There's more information on our report. And with that, I will thank everyone for calling in, and I'm happy to do questions, however we want to handle that.
Great. So as a reminder, we invite all questions. We have two right now. So if you have one, you can enter yours by pressing the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Now we have three. The first one is from Amy, and she asks, are both systems open?
Open meaning, I'm assuming you're talking about fare gates. Yes, they essentially use the same means of fare enforcement. So they're proof of payment systems. Proof of payment systems meaning there's no fare gates. There are random checks that are done in the system. The one other caveat I would add to that is Manchester police do patrol the system along with fare enforcement agents. Transport for Greater Manchester does not pay. They don't have to pay Manchester police in the way that many transit agencies in the United States have to pay police for associated security. But yeah, I'm assuming that's what that question is. They both have the same sort of system of fare checking.
Great. And if that's not, if that was a different context, Amy, you can type back in and we can make sure we answer that. And then the second one is, will these slides be made available?
I'm happy to. A lot of this information is also in the report. So unless someone else objects, I'm happy to.
Okay. And then
just to add to that, I mean, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on C2 Smart's YouTube site. And the full report will be published pretty soon. And we also have a more condensed paper version that is currently under review.
And third, we have in New York, the MTA's Second Avenue subway phase 2 looks as if it will cost more than phase 1 on a per mile basis. This is happening despite the fact that cost issues have been previously raised by other sources such as the New York Times and NYU's previous work. And your estimation, are there fundamental governance or accountability issues that are getting in the way of dealing with this?
That's a big question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would like to think that people want to actually address this issue. One thing that I would say is that some of the prior publications that have been made are made from the sort of planning perspective, which is obviously an important perspective. One of the things I was hoping to do with this report is to try and be at least a little bit more concrete on policy recommendations, try and help that issue. But yeah, there are definitely governance issues. I think the trick is trying to figure out how to change, our governance models to address it. But that's a big question. I think there's a lot that could go into that question.
And then lastly, we have curious if you were able to surface level look at comparison of Amtrak to other countries' passenger rail systems. And then do you think your findings apply?
They partially. I mean, there's a lot in the report. I would say one thing I talked about franchising and how franchising works, there are kind of Amtrak's business model is fairly unique. That's what I was finding. So a lot of the EU has a business model where you have a separate agency that maintains track and you have a separate agency that runs trains. And so you have competition there. So that didn't apply, that's why it's not in this presentation. It is in the report. So I think, there's an issue with business models that could apply to Amtrak as well. And I think some of the engineering things, so the need for kind of consistent national design standards would certainly apply. The aluminum issue, Amtrak has now begun to move to with Acela. So some of these findings would apply. I'm not sure all of them would apply. Some of them would certainly apply.
Great. So that's our last question. Oh, we just got another one. Lucas Johnson says, thank you for the invite and he enjoyed your presentation. Point of clarification, you may have recorded this feedback from someone, but I did not advise TriMet LRVs are purchased according to FRA standards, and slides seem to imply that. I did advise that ASME Art Scene 1 is more relevant. Do you have any findings related to that?
So ASME, so there's multiple people who said that. So I should note that there are multiple people who said that the FRA requirements, multiple people at TriMet who said that the FRA requirements are applied. What Lucas is referring to, and thanks for the question, based on those FRA regulations, there are also industry regulations. I will note I'm not a mechanical, I'm a civil, but at least based on my review of those industry regulations, those were also updated to reflect the fact that FRA changed their requirements. So yeah, so there were multiple people who said that, but those standards have also been updated.
And then one of the reasons for high costs was due to jurisdictional or third-party requirements. Did you remove those costs and then compare the systems?
So there is in the report, and I'm forgetting the numbers. What we tried to do is basically take out some of the line items from Portland's costs that were the product of those jurisdictional requests. So basically a lot of the active warning and the signaling and the roadway work. I'm forgetting the numbers off the top of my head. They're in the report, but essentially, even once we took those out and we developed a kind of like for like comparison, Portland's costs definitely get closer to Manchester, but they're not the same.
And then another one just came in, which is just a comment that some of the speed restrictions that TriMet Max faces are due to noise mitigation, i.e. NEPA, and follow-up complaints.
That's a good point. That's not something that I knew, but that's definitely a good point. Yeah.
Great. So I think that's our last question. Oh, got one more. Did you look at the element of security in the franchising operations?
So I'm not exactly sure what that question is getting at. I'm assuming it's saying who's responsible for security. And as I'd mentioned, Manchester police are responsible for security. So that is essentially cost savings for Manchester because they don't have to pay police. I'm assuming that's what that question is getting at, but I'm not too sure.
If not, Genevieve, you can
Yep.
type in now and you can just give it a second. And if you're asking a question, you can keep going. We have a few more minutes. Otherwise, I'll assume that is what that question meant as well. Yes, great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody for your questions. And to Chetan and Professor Chow for today's webinar. Again, a recording will be available on the center's YouTube channel and our website. And this webinar was brought to you by C2 Smart and USDOT's University Transportation Center program. We don't have any more questions, so I think we can close out. So thank you everybody and have a great day.